Today, we're going to be looking at how we are governed in Australia and around the world with differing forms of government. So, last week, we looked at this idea of how a government fits in a concept of social contract theory. We're going to continue that today. So, John Locke wrote the following: "The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community, for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater security against any that are not of it." Interesting. So it kind of is talking about what we went over at the end of last GLO, where we talked about how everybody willingly gives up their ultimate freedoms for the benefit of working in a society. This is what Locke's social contract looks like. I love that quote at the beginning. "Civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state and nature." So we, the people on the left, with equal rights and power, give up or transfer that power to the executive and the judge, that is our parliament and the court systems, in return for security and protection. So it's interesting that we sacrifice some freedoms, but for ultimately more than we give away, I think. So here's what we're going to look at today in this GLO. We're going to be looking at which forms of government actually are best suited to social contract theory. We're going to look at what a democracy actually looks like and a constitutional democracy and the core factors of that. We're going to consider whether Australia is a real democracy, and we're going to finally compare Australia's democratic system to that of other nations. Let's have a look at the different forms of governance. We have six terms here, different forms of government. What I'd like you to do is access your doc and write down each of these and come up with a definition of what you think these could be before you start researching them. Afterwards, I'd like you to, next to your definition, actually research what they mean and come back and paste it next to your definition. You should be able to see a similarity in a lot of ways, but there might be differences. You might have missed some, and that's great. That means you know now. This will add to your notes. Finally, I want you to look at advantages and disadvantages for each one of these government forms. Can you write them in a third column or a fourth column right next to these? Here's an interesting chart for you to look at. You've got all these different types of government forms or government systems, and they've been put on a chart. You've got authority, anarchy, and collective individual. That is, authority from left to right, and who makes the rules from bottom to top. So you see the monarchy at the top right-hand corner has complete authority, but the individual has the authority. This quote was spoken by Winston Churchill. It's really interesting. So it says, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it's been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." So what Winston Churchill is saying here is that democracy is absolutely awful, but it's actually the best of the worst. So all other forms of government are actually much worse than democracy. But he's definitely not saying that democracy itself is the best solution. After all, as we can see in the last few years in Australia, politicians have clashing issues as well as potentially coming in and out a fair bit. So democracy is not particularly great or perfect, but it is better than our forms of government around the world, like dictatorships and other regimes. Democracy is the modern standard. How do the others achieve stability? Well, let's look at dictatorships. You probably have heard this before, and your mind probably goes to someone like Hitler, Mussolini. Dictators exert their control through fear and oppression and theological relevance. That means that the individual controls the army, society, generates propaganda, and has punishments for a number of things. People fear this leader and respect them through theological means or otherwise. So can you take in your notes and write down how this fits with social contract theory and whether dictatorships can actually end up running? Let's have a look at democracy. So it comes from Greek origins and it means government of the people. What we ask ourselves and what we always must reflect upon is whether we actually still see a government of the people or not only in Australia but around the world. There are two primary types of democracy: direct democracy and representative democracy. We're going to be looking at these later in greater detail. Let's look at this quote by Schumter. The democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. The purpose of democratic method is not to select representatives who carry out the will of the people, but to choose individuals who will govern on their behalf. The main reason I show you this quote is that we are not representing people to carry out our will. We are representing people who will govern on behalf of us. A subtle difference, but ultimately what it means is that these people will not always do what we want them to do. They will govern on our behalf. So sometimes that may clash with what we believe. But we are electing them. We believed in their election campaigns. We believed in them. And so by electing them, we are basically giving them this power. So who are the people? The people could be anyone in that particular electorate, or just the people in general in a society. So who could maybe not be part of society? Who is not the people? Something to think about. We'll talk about it in class. Let's have a look at some liberal democracy principles. So some elements that establish liberal democracy are as follows. A belief in the individual. That is, we believe that the individual is both rational and moral. We believe in reason and progress, that we are naturally evolving, that is growing and developing as a people, whether it's culturally, socially, through science and otherwise, and we evolve through the art of compromise. A belief in a society that is consensual, that is, everybody wants order and cooperation. Nobody wants disorder and conflict, or at least the majority does not. And finally, shared power. So liberal democracies are not dictatorships where we have concentrated power. We want to shy away from that and move towards shared power for everybody. In Australia, that's in the form of a vote and the chance to run for election and office. So do we actually live in a democracy? Let's look at Hirst's quote. Have a read. So Hirst is saying the people do not rule. We are a representative democracy. We can influence what our representatives do, but we don't have a positive influence. We have a negative one. If they don't do something we like, we'll get rid of them and try someone else. Could be a lot of problems with this. Might take a while to get one that we actually like. Maybe we like them, but then they do something wrong and we have to start again. Now you can start to see what Churchill meant when he said that it's the worst one, but better than all the rest. So are we actually democracy? Hirst again says that democracy is a society in which the citizens are sovereign and control the government. Do we actually control the government here? I guess the word is control. Do we actually control the government, or do we actually have some sort of power? Well, in Australia, we have the vote. We have the option to run as an elected official, and we also have other ways of achieving influence. So later on in this semester, you might be wanting to choose for one of your presentations the idea of influence in political parties, particularly with political donations. That could be something that you look at and consider when asking the question, is Australia really a democracy? Let's have a look at the concept of sovereignty. So the idea of sovereignty is that you have territorial integrity over a particular location. And then the sovereign is the person or the power who has the power to actually make laws for this area. In Australia, our key document is the Australian Constitution. It was approved by the people, amended by the people, after going through political approval, that is, a referendum. So a referendum is a vote by the people to change the Constitution. Prior systems like the Privy Council still had lawmaking power through appeals, but it was not through the Constitution or on the Constitution. There is a quasi-sovereignty in the people in Australia. Let's have a look at the three systems. We've got Australia, America, and the United Kingdom. We all have a governing document. For Australia and the United States of America, it is a constitution, whereas the UK has a complex system of legislation. In Australia, we have a constitutional democracy and a constitution that is amended by the people and the politicians. Whereas in America, we have a constitution that is amended by the states and therefore is a republic. Whereas we know in the UK, the legislation is amended by the politicians, but there is a monarchy. That is, the Queen of England is the monarch of the UK. Thanks for watching this GLO. Looking forward to seeing you in class.